I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Today we're reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 13, and let's focus on verses 21 through 27a. When Jesus said this, he was troubled in his spirit and testified, "I assure you, one of you will betray me." And his disciples started looking at one another, uncertain of which one he was talking about. And one of his disciples, the one Jesus loved, was reclining close to Jesus. Simon Peter motioned to him to find out who it was he was talking about. And so he leaned back against Jesus and he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus replied, "He's the one I give the piece of bread to after I have dipped it." And when he had dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas, Simon Iscariot's son. After Judas ate the bread, Satan entered him. That's John chapter 13, verses 21 through 27a. You know, traditional Christian assumption concerning the Last Supper is that the only elements involved were wine and unleavened bread. And in actuality, Jesus and his disciples were observing the Passover Seder. And the Seder is a whole meal, which utilizes many symbolic elements to recount Israel's slavery in Egypt and God's deliverance of Israel from Egyptian bondage, as well as his provision for them during the Hebrews' 40 years of desert wandering. So there is no biblical evidence that when Jesus singled out two of the Seder's elements, that he was replacing the Seder. He was simply clarifying what two of the elements represented within the meal, so that when the Seder was observed in the future, well, then his followers would understand and worship him correctly when they got to those points. Without knowledge of the Seder and its elements, many Christians believe that Jesus dipped his bread into the wine and gave it to Judas. And as a matter of fact, some churches go as far as serving communion by dipping bread into wine. But the problem with that notion is that matzah, which is unleavened bread, is not dipped into the wine at any point during the Seder. So only two of the elements in the Seder are used for sopping or dipping matzah into the charaset, which is a sweet paste made with fruit and nuts and spices and wine. And then there is the maror, which is the bitter herb. It's a paste made from horseradish root. The charaset is symbolic of the mortar for the bricklaying that the Israelite slaves made in Egypt. The maror symbolizes the bitterness of slavery. And when Jesus dipped the bread, he was most likely following the tradition of sopping charaset and maror onto his matzah and then combined it with lamb. And this would have been symbolic of the bondage that Yeshua, or Jesus, was about to undergo as a result of Judas's betrayal, as well as his bitter suffering for the sin of the world. So in essence, Jesus shared the gospel with Judas in a sandwich. Today's passage and the events thereof were predicted by the psalmist hundreds of years before the last Seder. Consider the words of Psalm 41, verses 9 and 10. "Even my friend, in whom I trusted, one who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. But you, Lord, be gracious to me and raise me up. Then I will repay them." Psalm 41, verses 9 and 10. Consider that as you approach communion. I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Check us out at www.groundworksministries.com.